Today on Rates and Barrels, we take a trip to Starkville. Jayson Stark and Doug Glanville join us as we discuss the best teenage position players in baseball history and a tweak that Jayson believes could improve the ABS system. Let's go. Welcome to Rates and Barrels. It's Tuesday, April 7th. Derek Van Riper, Eno here with two special guests joining us. Jayson Stark and Doug Glanville are here as we dig into a pressing question. Who are the best teenagers we've ever seen in baseball history? And not just the four of us, but the collective we, like of all time. We're going to focus on some position players. Jayson, Doug, first and foremost, thank you both for joining us today.
Hey, thank you. You know, the great thing is we're not just joining you, we're literally joining Rates and Barrels, right? We're really excited to be part of this show.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. You know, I don't know if you're officially a town or if you've been annexed at some point, but you know, we always think of geography when you think of our run with Starkville. So it's great to be part of the show and looking forward to all the conversations for sure.
So would Rates and Barrels be like a subdivision or like a suburban housing development in Starkville? What do you think?
We're now spanning the U.S. at least. You know, we have the Midwest, and I've got the West, you know, down. So now we span the U.S.
Yeah, good Northeast coverage now. I'd say we're a neighborhood within Starkville. I think that's the right way to think about it. The return to Starkville Saturday, April 18th, will be the first full episode back, but we're excited to have you guys with us here today. So that's the huge show news right off the top. People may have seen in the trailer that went out about 3 weeks ago now. Yeah, Saturdays on Rates and Barrels. Pretty awesome to have that as part of our programming. I wanted to just ask you guys first, when you start to think about a huge question like this, where does your mind go when someone says, who's the best teenage position player in baseball history? Do you immediately just take off and start going to Baseball Reference or Fangraphs, or do you just start indexing through your own priors and just start to like wrestle with that debate internally before you start going the research route? I'm just like, what was the first thought when this question came to mind for you, Doug?
Well, first I disqualified myself. I thought that was easy, so I could strike one off the list, and I was that much closer to my answer. Unless I go back to high school, but yeah, I had fun with it because I first thought about, did I play with any of these guys? You know, I was trying to figure out if I played with some teen phenoms, and you know, I started to think about minor league baseball a little bit. I know I played against Alex Rodriguez in Double-A, and then I was just wondering who was a teenager that had a phenomenal season, and maybe there were some that had many seasons. You know, they got up and they stayed. So I just had fun with that, thinking of my career, and it was certainly hard for me to go past 1980 or something, but it's just it's a remarkable achievement. You know, whoever it is, if they just showed up as a teenager in the big leagues, that is monumental.
That's so true. And you know, it's funny when you ask that question of someone like me, is that a rhetorical question? Do I research this? I research everything.
But do you instantly research it, or do you just think through it first? Because I don't even process much of the question on my own. I'm immediately opening up a leaderboard and just starting to pare down answers right away because I want the right answer. And I feel like that's not the most fun way for a human brain to actually work.
Well, we've all seen a lot of baseball. I guess I've seen more than you guys. And I did think back before I clicked search on great teenage phenoms who I've seen who left a mark on me because I saw them. And the three guys that really popped out were Andrew Jones in that 96 World Series was breathtaking. And then the teenage Bryce Harper arriving in the big leagues. The game was on ESPN. I remember we sat around and made it a point to watch Bryce Harper make his debut because that was an event. And then Juan Soto was a little different. I don't think he had that kind of buzz when he first got to the big leagues, but then it didn't take long to figure it out. And just the fact that he debuted before he debuted and hit a home run before he debuted because of the suspended game. He did the time travel thing. You knew he was good. We didn't know he was that good. So I thought about all that before I started the research, but the research was fun.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who's watched me try to do trivia knows that the very first thing I did was open the computer. I don't know, my computer is my brain, but I did really enjoy going through the names and just having you describe those. Those are the touch points for my lifetime. And I remember I was a Braves fan in Atlanta, and Andrew Jones was the great big hype. You know, that was going to be our great player, and he is still, I believe, the youngest player to ever hit a home run in the World Series. And that was just a tragic World Series, though. So there was a little bit of tragedy there, because that was the series that the Braves won the first 3 and lost the last 4. So that was a little tough for young me. But Bryce Harper really reminds me a little bit of LeBron James, where, you know, there was so much hype. It was even more than Andrew Jones, because we at that point had a media pipeline where we'd been watching him in perfect games. And I think there was there like a perfect game home run derby that we saw when he was in high school or something on ESPN, whereas Bryce Harper, I think in high school or something.
The famous home run in the Trop that went over like the second deck, hit the back wall of the Trop. It's pretty legendary.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then he delivered. I mean, that's the other thing that's so hard about baseball. You know, the reason the baseball draft isn't the same as the football draft or the basketball draft is that, you know, there's so much time between, you know, we don't usually hype up high schoolers because we know it's usually going to take 2 or 3 or 4 years before we see them in the big leagues, and there might be a lot of struggle in between. So, you know, that's why the one that really stood out for me in research was Robin Yount, because Robin Yount was drafted 3 years after the Brewers moved to Milwaukee, and he gets to Milwaukee, and the last 4 draft picks, first round draft picks, haven't really worked out, except Darryl Porter's is playing all right. And so I imagine there's a lot of pressure on him to go from being drafted the year before to being the starting shortstop, and not just an outfielder or, you know, a left fielder or something, but like the starting shortstop for a team that only existed 3 or 4 years, and that everyone's like, are we going to ever be good? You know, and then he comes up and he's the shining hope. He did struggle those first couple of years. He wasn't as good as he was later on in his career, obviously. But I imagine that must have been a lot of pressure on him. And I wondered about, is it better to come up like Andrew Jones on a team that's good around you? And what's more pressure? I would throw this to you maybe, Doug. It's like, is it more pressure to come up on a great team where everyone expects you to sort of be great because the team is great? Or maybe they can ignore you for a little bit because the team is great and they don't worry about that kid. Because let's think about Anthony Volpe. He comes up, there's a ton of pressure on him, even though the Yankees are good around him. But I just imagine that the contextual stuff around Robin Yount must have been insane.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Like, a guy like Volpe is a great example. I mean, but to come up, you know, for me, it was probably better that I came up, the Cubs, we weren't really that good. And, you know, the expectations were very different. I mean, yeah, you could talk about winning, but you could see we were kind of in trouble already. And I wasn't ordained. It wasn't like, hey, you're coming, you're the starting center fielder, that's it, we're done, you're the next 40 years. It was really more about like, okay, I'm going to platoon, you know, I'm going to kind of figure out this big league thing.
Find a role.
Yeah, find a role, like be put in situation to succeed, you know, go to winter ball, come back, you know. I felt like I had a longer runway, even though I was older. So I was itching to be that guy, you know, right away. But I also learned how to value that I had a little bit of room to kind of make my mistakes and then like fight my way. And then I was traded ultimately, where I did become that starter. And those 2 teams, by the way, the Cubs when I came up was, you know, a bunch of older guys, married, settled, established, you know, Mark Grace, Sean Dunson, Sandberg, whoever. And then the Phillies, I became part of the core, you know, the younger kind of group. Everybody's kind of in a very different place. And I felt like what was good about the Phillies, even though I was probably, turning 28, was more about, okay, we're going to do this together. It's nice to kind of come up in a wave, because then you can look to each other. I think of the St. Louis Cardinals right now. You have, Mason Wynn and Jordan Walker and, Weatherholt, and, they're young, and they're like, okay, well, you don't feel alone. So I found that to be really helpful, but I imagine it's really tough. I mean, I can't even imagine being a teenager and then doing all this, because I was drafted at 20. So I just started at 20 in the minors, and these guys are expected to produce. I mean, it's really something.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a time where Jackson Holliday is already a relative disappointment. He still has plenty of time to put the pieces together and have a magnificent career. And it's funny that you just mentioned, Konnor Griffin was the inspiration for this discussion today. And we know that he's nearing an agreement on what was reported to be a 9-year, $140 million deal. This is according to Buster Olney of ESPN. As the Pirates released a social media clip, a get-to-know Konnor Griffin clip, we all learned that he got married already. he's already crossed that bridge. He's entered that phase of his life. He kind of gives off the vibe of a veteran, which is surprising for a teenager. I was thinking about it too, Jayson, that maybe having someone who didn't break through as a teenager but has broken through with a ton of hype in Paul Skenes in the same clubhouse probably helps. You have one guy right there who can relate to the immense pressure that Konnor Griffin is going to be under as now kind of the position player, franchise player in Pittsburgh.
I think that's a great point. And, we were talking about the Bryce buzz and the Andrew buzz. Where does the Konnor Griffin buzz fit? We need a buzz meter. Doug, get on that. Invent a buzz meter, would you? And it matters because, if you think about this really big picture, when a player arrives in the big leagues as a teenager, he's probably bound for greatness. I know it's not everybody. I'm thinking Jerickson Profar is not going to have a plaque in that plaque gallery in Cooperstown, but I was curious. I counted 66 Hall of Famers who played their first full season as a teenager. That's a big number. If you get to the big leagues that young, you've got a chance to do stuff. The only thing is that it's so much harder now than it was 50 years ago, 75 years ago, 100 years ago, because we have a draft now. We have college baseball as a force now. If you get drafted out of high school, you got basically one full season in the minor leagues, and then here you are. You're up in the big leagues. So I think that's the reason why Konnor Griffin, teenage number one prospect, $140 million contract, debuts home opener in Pittsburgh. That's way up there on the buzz meter for me.
Yeah, they set that up. They made that a bigger event by choosing that day as his debut.
And the team context, just to go back to that, this is not so much, it's a little bit more, it's not the Brewers, because the Brewers are this expansion team, right? They're not expected, it's more like Doug is saying, they're not expected to be great. But this is supposed to be the first Pirates team that's going to make the playoffs in a long time, right? They're projected to make the playoffs, and Konnor Griffin is supposed to be a part of that. So that is on his shoulders right now. And, I think there's a lot we can still like, and it's really obviously really early in his career, but he swings the bat hard. The defense has been good, and it looks like he's shouldering this responsibility well. But at 19, if I had been said, hey, Eno, the Pirates are going to make the playoffs if you're good this year. They haven't in a really long time. I would freak out.
Yeah, I would not have anything to offer at 19. I mean, I never did at any point in my life, but especially at 19 years old, I was not prepared to be any sort of professional, unless drinking Coors Light was something that could go pro at 19. But it's not a good skill, actually, in hindsight. I'm pretty overweight on knowledge of the last 10 years in particular, basically the StatCast era. And I think my knowledge as a fan kind of goes back to being a kid. Ken Griffey Jr. was the first teenager I truly remember getting a chance in the big leagues, but I wasn't watching those games, so I've only read about them and looked at them from a numbers perspective. So he's sort of like the starting point for me. Andrew Jones is the first one that I do remember watching, so I'm glad he's a part of the conversation. And then, as Eno was saying, Bryce Harper has delivered on the hype. Really the first prospect I could remember in baseball that I could see the hype from age 14, 15 in Sports Illustrated, and then also see the debut and the career start to play out, right? I think Griffey maybe got a lot of early career buzz. I don't remember. You guys can fill me in if I'm wrong. Jayson, was Griffey getting any sort of buzz like Harper as an amateur?
Yeah, it was really similar because his dad was so famous from being a member of the Big Red Machine. And then he was literally playing in the same outfield as his father. That was
amazing.
Pretty freaking huge. And then, he was just such a magnetic player and magnetic personality with the catches he would make and like that stance, that swing, just very signature. You can't forget the Ken Griffey taking BP with his cap turned backwards in Yankee Stadium and all those veteran Yankees staring at it, and that, like, he was a definite thing as a teenager. I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, if I was going to do my all-teen team, I think he's the second tier for me. Bryce Harper was a 5-win player as a 19-year-old. It's crazy. Ken Griffey wasn't that from the moment he hit the big leagues, but you knew where it was headed, right? We knew this guy had a chance to be something special, and we were not wrong.
Yeah, I think you're dead on in the sense that, like, a 2.5 win season is really good, but there are better years. We're going to dig into those in just a minute. I think it's a good reminder, too, for any player that debuts. Mike Trout, good reminder of this. I think it was only 40 games his first year. He played those as a 19-year-old. Mike Trout wasn't Mike Trout right out of the gates, right? It took part of a season for him to make an adjustment, comes back in his first full year, and then looks like the guy that's going to cruise into Cooperstown. We are going to take a quick break. When we come back, we make our selections for the best teenage position player in Major League history. Welcome back to Rates and Barrels. We are making our selections for the best teenage position player in Major League history. Jayson, who are you taking at 1-1 in this hypothetical draft?
I think I would go Mel Ott, and just because I've written so much about like guys who got to the big leagues young and how good they were young. And Mel Ott debuted in the major leagues at 17 years old and hit 383 with a 393 on base. That'll work. Okay. at 19, he had a 193 OPS plus. He had a 397 on base at 19. Just an incredible teenage talent who went on to Cooperstown. Was great from day one. And I just don't know that there's been anything quite like that. I thought real hard about Robin Yount, though. So anybody who wants to take Robin Yount, I would definitely go a thumbs up.
I just have a rules question because, if we go back to 1928 in Mel Ott, when there was no child labor laws, is it really that impressive that you're in the big leagues at 17? I mean, my 9-year-old could have been a dentist back in 28. I mean, so I'm just the labor situation, a little bit different back then,
Yeah. And that's really relevant because I love the wiki page for Mel Ott because apparently he was being paid for baseball at 14. They said that his semi-pro team that he played on, they had a tradition of passing the hat whenever a player hit a home run, and that means he was taking home money when he was 14. And then he found a job at 16 in a lumber mill. So he was in a lumber mill, and that's where they found him. That's where the John McGraw found him on the company team for a lumber mill. So you're not lying. There's some labor law situations here.
Oh wait, so they weren't scouting kids from well-manicured travel ball diamonds back then? Weird.
With alternate uniforms.
with years and years of radar gun data and bat speed data?
Starring in the perfect game circuit or starring for the lumber mill? I'm going lumber mill every day.
Well, I love it. I mean, if you set the hits total, the teenage hits total at 200, then Mel Ott has the best OPS by 200 points. Robin Yount had the second most hits, but he had a 656 OPS. It was mostly singles, I guess. It was not. He hadn't grown into his power yet. Someone tell me about Phil Cavaretta. He's the hits leader. That's it, only a 716 OPS, but I know very little about him.
Yeah, here I'm gonna pass the baton to someone that knows more than me. The only thing I've learned about Phil Cavaretta, well, there's 3 things I've learned in about the last 24 hours. 1, prominent Cub. 2, number 1 in plate appearances by teenagers in the big leagues of all time, 1,145. So he played a lot as a teenager. Number 3 also wore number 44 like Anthony Rizzo. So I think there's an expectation that someday Anthony Rizzo's number will be retired, and maybe they can like talk a little about Phil Cavaretta when that happens. But what will they say? Jayson, Doug, I hope one or both of you knows more about Phil Cavaretta than I do, because he was a really good player.
Doug was a Cub. I'm sure. Wasn't Phil Cavaretta hanging around the clubhouse?
No, it's possible. I didn't know it at the time, though. So I saw a lot of Ron Santo and let's play 2. That's all I had to start thinking just who was a teenager at all. And I kind of started with my era, or at least generally around that time. And these names, I'm just reading them off, like Adrian Beltre, this is a guy who came up, teenager. I remember bunting on Beltre and was so confident it was a hit. I was like going into my turn towards second. I was like, oh, this is easy. And he threw me out. Like, I was like looking back, like it was like Harold Reynolds when Bo Jackson threw him out from like the wall. I was like, who is that over there? I mean, guy was amazing from jump. And, there's a, 3,000 hit, or, he had this huge career with, Hall of Fame, obviously. So, but I always think of also guys like Todd Van Poppel, right, who came up with the hype, and didn't quite go the same direction. But those are guys, Van Poppel had so much behind him. It was like a Strasburg kind of moment. And so to think about, the guy that you say, okay, was up at, as a teen, like Mike Trout or A-Rod, right? These are guys, their numbers are eye-popping. If, had you known kind of thing, then now that we have the context of their whole career. And I want to throw one name out there that my brother, and, it's hard for me to do this because we had a rivalry growing up, but I have to admit, Cesar Cedeno came up as a teenager, and this guy was, all the tools, the speed, the defense, the power, phenomenal glove, could throw. He was like that 5 tool early on. So really, really cool to kind of reminisce on that, because I heard that name a lot growing up.
I got a question for you guys. If we're doing a draft, and we get the benefit of doing it knowing what we know what happened. Are you taking Bryce Harper or Juan Soto? Juan Soto as a teenager had a 923 OPS and a 406 on base before he turned 20 years old. Who are you taking?
I'm taking Soto. I just feel like that plate discipline is going to serve him so well. I remember talking to Joey Votto early in his career, and he was like, the way for me to age the best and to give the most that I can give as long as I can give, is to only swing at strikes and to never swing at balls. And I talked to Juan Soto, and he said someone showed me in single A that the batting average or the OPS on balls inside the zone versus outside the zone, and I made a decision not to ever swing at strikes outside the zone. I just feel like Soto is going to use that OBP to have a great OPS his whole career, and is going to have longevity despite not having the sort of physical tools of a Bryce Harper, honestly, in terms of running and defense and being a better glove in the field and a better base runner. I think that Soto is basically the teenage OPS leader, among all of these players that we've talked about. So that would be my first round pick if I could take. I hate to be recency bias, but it was a really great start.
Yeah, it was. So let me ask you this: does Bryce get franchise changer points? You know what I mean? When he got to Washington, the entire franchise shifted to another gear, to another level. The interest level, the expectation level, just the trajectory of success of the group, it changed.
Like that Yount context that we're talking about, right? Like the taking a team that wasn't anything and making it into something.
Right. Now, I mean, Soto basically replaced Bryce, which is another interesting plot twist, but
and then won.
Right, but you were talking about Robin Yount. and what he meant for the Brewers, how he changed the Brewers because they were so young in their arc. And the Nationals had existed before they got to Washington. I get that. And Ryan Zimmerman was there when they arrived, and I get that. But Bryce was the first true Washington Nationals superstar, right? And I feel like to have all right, he was a 5-win player as a 19-year-old with all the stuff swirling around him. Like, that's bigger to me than what Juan Soto did in a way.
Interesting. Would it change if Juan Soto wins with the Mets? He wouldn't change the Mets, though. You know,
I mean,
it wouldn't be the same thing.
They're both going to the Hall of Fame. So,
right.
It feels like grading on a curve. I don't know. I mean, Juan Soto got through the minor leagues so fast, and I think it was injuries to Victor Robles and at least one or two other guys that were ahead of him on the organizational depth chart that led him to debut as quickly as he did. We didn't get prospect fatigue from Juan Soto. He didn't make it to the top of the list. He didn't have time. He just got moved faster than expected. And I wonder if, with good health for Victor Robles that year, if we don't see Soto at all in the year in which he debuted, or we see him maybe in September, we see him really late, I wonder if that just changes some of the perceptions of him as a player. I think he just showed up so fast, people weren't even necessarily ready for it. They weren't even familiar with the idea of how good he could be outside of, prospect analysts. I think there's certainly a group of people that knew how good he could be. But for most of us, we weren't sitting here stewing in the hype for 2 or 3 years. Griffin didn't really get that opportunity either. Like, pretty much everything he did last year in the minors is what moved him to the top of prospect lists, right? So that's the other part of this. With Harper and Griffey, they were in unique situations as far as the amount of attention they were getting before they even stepped on a big league field.
Can I throw out one more name? Tony Conigliaro. And
I'm just looking him up.
Just because of this story, playing pretty much every day for the Red Sox at 19 years old, hits 24 homers with a 133 OPS, and then leads the league in homers at 20, and then that next year gets hit in the face by that pitch. And, at that point, he becomes one of the great what-if stories in history. It made me think about, what are we looking at when we do this all teenager team? Can we just look at that moment in time when these players were teenagers and nothing else? I mean, Konnor Griffin is not going to last long. He'll be 20 in 2 weeks. But it's fun to think about if those teenage years had just kept on going, what the guy would have been. That's where you put Tony Conigliaro.
He's the fastest or he was at some point the fastest to 100 homers in American League history.
Well, it's like, it's the season, right? The isolation of, you were a teenager and here's the season you had. And then it's like the career, right? The impact, if you have it. And that's, he didn't get that chance. He didn't have and that's what's tough, if you can pick a guy now that you have all the context, right? But the fact that they were teenagers and did it for that long, that's something to be said. Even if they're walk machines, to play, 20 years, it's really incredible to have that kind of longevity and then keep putting up numbers.
Yeah, there's some names I stumbled into that I really want to even learn more about after this episode. Jim Gilliam, #1 in hitter F4, if you search the Fangraphs leaderboard. Played in the Negro Leagues for 3 years and then eventually was a Dodger for a long time. Very versatile player. Not considered like an all-time great in franchise history, but a very good player that in a different era maybe does even more than what he did. John Montgomery Ward, a two-way player who's 15th in hitter F4 and first in pitcher F4 for teenagers. There's a guy I know nothing about. Very interesting. One guy that I did see
Good shopping. Good shopping, man.
Great shopping. One guy that I saw, I didn't realize how good he was right away, is Edgar Renteria. Right? It's kind of a glove first amount of value that he brought when he debuted with the Marlins back in 1996. But he hit 309 with a 358 OBP. He just didn't have a ton of power. So that's the thing that modern shortstops do much more than shortstops in the 90s and prior. but he was a 3.5 WAR player in 1996 over 106 games. Like, that's more value than he generated in the next 3 seasons combined. That kind of blows my mind.
I want to throw Al Kaline in there too. If you start looking at guys who had 20 years of greatness, Al Kaline's always on the list. Debuts at 18, everyday center fielder for the Tigers before turning 20 years old, and then was always around for the next 60 years. You could walk into the Tigers clubhouse. Doug, you probably did this, right? 10 years ago, Al Kaline's sitting there at a locker in full uniform. It was incredible. He was Al Kaline. He was just a walking legend every day of his life. And it all starts as 18-year-old big leaguer.
In terms of players that'll have the same amount of playing time before they turn 20, and our shortstops, quote unquote comps. I'm not taking it all the way where I'm like, they look like Griffin. I'm just saying they had the same amount of time, and they played the same position. I guess, Renteria's close. Gary Sheffield had 24 games as a teenager. And it was at shortstop. I think Griffin will stay at shortstop longer than Gary did. But he had that violent swing that I would love so much. That was kind of a stick ball outside. I always did the Gary Sheffield. In fact, still to this day, when I go into the hitting cages, I do the Gary Sheffield because I love it so much. But A-Rod got 47 games, and they weren't amazing in themselves. And there's maybe some similarities there in terms of big-bodied shortstop with power and speed coming up as a teenager. I don't want to say Konnor Griffin is A-Rod. I'm not saying that. But, there's some similarities there where they'll get around 40 games each as teenagers. They may struggle in those first 40 games, and they may still have, Hall of Fame-type careers.
We talk about WRC Plus a lot on this show, and if you sort the leaderboard by WRC Plus, a familiar name to our longtime listeners shows up: Oyster Burns. Oyster Burns.
Yes.
Oyster Burns came up 7 years ago or 8 years ago on this show. I think it was the first year we were doing the show. I forget why we came across him, but we learned that he's maybe the worst teammate of all time, because in between games of a doubleheader in 1893, his teammate Tom Daly was sleeping in center field when Burns stabbed him with a penknife. Daly awoke and turned on the knife, leading to a severed tendon, which kept Daly out for 2 weeks. Yeah. So Oyster Burns, the man who stabbed a teammate in the outfield in between games of a doubleheader, is the all-time WRC Plus leader among teenagers in the major leagues with a 155. Better than Juan Soto. Better than everyone else we've talked about on this episode. Hard to believe, but a terrible teammate.
Why did he stab him? Was there some reason? He didn't like oysters?
I don't know if there's. It just kind of seems like this is the vibe of Oyster Burns. Just generally bad guy, like maybe a prank gone wrong. Hard to say exactly, but I was stunned to see his name atop that leaderboard.
He was named Oyster because he sold shellfish in the off season, but he was described as a, quote, loudmouth and having an irritating voice and personality.
Okay.
And he had multiple issues of assault on teammates. That was just that was the biggest one. Yeah.
So he's not really on this team because of his weighted runs created plus. He's on this team so you can tell all those stories.
Yeah.
Assaulting teammates.
We do a segment on teenage hitters, and we somehow get Oyster Burns and Victor Robles mentions in the same one. This is it.
Hey, I mean, without Victor Robles, history might have been a lot different for Juan Soto, at least the very, very beginning of his career. And I think if you want me to put a bow on it by making an actual pick, I think I'm going to go Harper over Soto for the selection here. I do think the defensive contributions matter. Harper was a good defensive corner outfielder when his career began. Juan Soto's never been a good defender. What they did upon arrival, extremely impressive. You could argue this and debate it for as long as you want. But as Jayson said earlier, you look up and down a list like this, it's packed with Hall of Famers. Usually if you're playing in the big leagues as a teenager, you have a much higher chance of becoming a Hall of Famer. You'll see Manny Machado is on this list. There's another future Hall of Famer there, but Ty Cobb's on the list. There's just names upon names of legendary players who got to the big leagues quickly and at least were better than league average as far as their contributions with the bat or their overall value, which is just stunning. So hopefully we'll see some amazing things from Konnor Griffin that gets him a place on this leaderboard these next few weeks before he celebrates his 20th birthday. We are going to take another quick break. When we come back, we discuss an idea Jayson had to improve the current ABS challenge system. Welcome back to Rates and Barrels. Let's talk about ABS. You guys have been talking to all sorts of folks around the game about the new system, the robots, as Jayson has called them for years. The robots are here, and they're getting, I think, generally applause. I mean, actual applause from fans, but I think generally the arrival of ABS, the rollout, has been pretty successful. And maybe we'll have some tweaks. You've suggested some already on The Athletic, and I think the tweak you've suggested that I want to see is automated challenges at the end of the game, right? Similar to what we see in football, where you don't have to challenge in the last 2 minutes. Like, you just, if something is borderline, we're going to take a look at it. We're going to get it right. The only concern I have about this, Jayson, I bet you have a solution for this, is how do you make sure that it doesn't, there are more little micro instances of things mattering in baseball where this would be used, right? We're generally talking about boundaries and scoring plays in the NFL. But every pitch could be under the microscope in the ninth inning. I don't necessarily want this to be something where we have to wait after every single pitch, go to the board, watch on our screens as the zone kind of flies at us. Like, how do we rectify that, the volume of things we'd be looking at in the ninth inning?
I wrote about this, I want to say 2 weeks ago, and it was to some degree inspired by the end of Team USA versus Dominican Republic. Last pitch of that game was not a strike, was called a strike. What did the robot say? Oh, wait, they didn't have ABS. So that game ended on that call, and I thought, that can't ever happen again, thank God. And then I thought, oh, wait, yes, it can. If the team is added challenges, that's how the seventh game of the World Series could theoretically end. And is that acceptable? We can't have that, right? We cannot have that happen. So what's a way to avoid having it happen? So I started asking questions, brainstorming with people in baseball, and that led us to the NFL parallel that you just alluded to. This was the best idea that I had. In the NFL, you get to the last 2 minutes, every scoring play is reviewable, correct? So in baseball, the suggestion was if you were out of challenges, you could still challenge a pitch that resulted in a run. You could still challenge the last pitch of the game. And that way, we're not challenging every pitch, but in the ninth inning, when you get to the biggest moment, there's still a vehicle to make sure the game is decided based on who should actually have won, not on what some umpire saw in the moment that fooled him in some way.
And I love thinking about these things, and the thing that we can't know are the second order effects, the sort of unintended consequences. I think putting my analyst hat on, my R&D analyst hat on, that would make me as a team more aggressive with my challenges, because I knew that I always had the fail-safe of the final one. Is that a big deal or not? I don't know, but it would mean more challenges because people would be more likely to use up their 2 challenges. So right now, I think teams are mostly like, well, we can take a shot with the first challenge. If we lose it, then we're going to become much more, we're going to hold on to that last challenge to the ninth inning. If we always knew that we couldn't lose the game on a challengeable call, then I think we would be more aggressive with that second one as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's what baseball wants. They like the idea of teams not over challenging and getting about maybe 4 challenges or so per game. But an interesting thing has happened since the season started. We didn't know what strategy was going to be in spring training because everybody was on a fact-finding mission, and the starters were out of the game. The game started at 1 by like 1:45. Okay, so you're really only getting a sense for it when the season started. And what happened? You had a couple of teams, especially the Twins and the Yankees, were challenging up a storm. They did massive traject training in spring training so that all their players were up to speed on what a strike is now. Not what it used to be, but what it is today with ABS. And so they came out of the gate challenging everything. And I think especially when teams start looking at the Yankees, challenging 8 times a game, overturning 6 calls a game, 7 calls a game, they're thinking, whoa, we need to do that too. And so I think you're seeing the number of challenges by quite a few teams early in games, like starting to rise in a huge way. And I don't know what the implications for that are, but I think you're going to see a clamor for more challenges, not less. And it'll be interesting to see what Major League Baseball is willing to tweak, because they've said they're open to tweaks if they will make the game better.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a great time just calling games and talking to a lot of the managers just to understand what's their strategy. They've openly admitted they're not really sure yet exactly how it's going to play out. Oli Marmol of the Cardinals would talk about, just go for it, and then we'll just kind of on the back end kind of see what we need to do. We saw Dylan Dingler of the Tigers just have a perfect game in challenging, and the thing that was so notable is, these pitches were, I mean, a tenth of a ball. I mean, they were not egregious calls. So you knew like the home plate upper was Mark Wegner. It's like he did a good job. It was like microscopic. And it made me think of the interview we had on Starkville with Max Scherzer in spring training. I think it was last year, about the buffer zone. Because he talked about, he was worried that there would be so many challenges or it would escalate that we should ignore the ones that are like a tenth of an inch. We should just focus on, the umpire missed it by 3 inches, because he wanted the flow, and and ABS has proven to be pretty quick. So I will say it doesn't seem that disruptive, but I feel like when they do multiple pitches in an inning, you're kind of like, okay, let's kind of keep this thing going here, So that's what I'm wondering about the strategy. And I've asked a lot of times to the managers, do you think the players that are known for the best plate discipline will be the best challengers? Are they one and the same? And I think some say, yeah, absolutely. Others, like we talked to Stephen Kwan or Corbin Carroll, and they say, well, there's aspects of the zone I know really well. And I feel, but then maybe that down and away I'm not as good at, which is why I don't swing at it. So maybe they have blind spots that don't necessarily make them great challengers. One funny story was Corbin Carroll, we interviewed him before the game, and he's like, absolutely, I'm not going to challenge really early. I'm just going to wait late in the game. It's just, I don't want to take away my team's challenges. I mean, it was like, and we asked Torey Lovello about it, and he said, that's what I want from my players. I want them to like be patient, wait and use it later in the game. First inning, 0-2 count, he gets rung up. He's like, I was like, okay, I guess. So
was he right?
You hear, and he was right. So, so you hear from managers saying, use it to flip a count, right? When 1-1 becomes 2-1 instead of 1-2. But you also hear a little bit about, well, if it's an out or a walk, that's pretty consequential. So, you want to turn that around. But they often say something about the emotion. They're worried about the emotion and that kind of reaction. And then you're doing the third inning on an 0-0 count, and it's just not where you want to do it. So I'm just curious to see like how this plays out, because the data is still coming in.
Yeah, that bit about emotion is fascinating, because the hitters are worse than the catchers. And I feel like the catchers are cold, calm, and collected and in receiving it. They see the whole zone. I feel like they are set up for it. And the hitters are set up for, no way, that was not a strike, and like tapping without thinking, you know. So what we've seen so far is that the hitters are worse than the catchers. The catchers have overturned something like 60%, and the hitters are in the 40s somewhere. The thing that worries me about that is that this will be overall a run suppressive thing. I think it'll lead to more run suppression. And what you see, if you're looking right now, we'll throw up on the screen, this is the improvement in right call percentage by zone. And this is something that we saw ahead of the season. I wrote about how the top of the zone, and I think Jayson did as well, that the top of the zone would be where we see the most change. And lo and behold, the change in right call percentage in the top corners is the biggest in the strike zone. But as you'll see, there are more strikes being called inside the zone than correct balls being called outside the zone. So I think this will be run suppressive in the end because the catchers are doing a better job than the hitters. And so the catchers are going to get more strikes than the hitters are going to get balls out of this. But then on the other side, we're going to see that the strike zone has shrunk a little bit and that we're going to see 750 fewer called strikes. So at some point, either the pitchers are going to get angry or the hitters are going to get angry. And I don't know, that might lead to change. Sometimes we see that the hitters or the pitchers at the block can actually affect change. Do you see this going either way, Jayson, that this has become run suppressive, or that the pitchers are losing a lot of strikes, or how do you see it?
I'm sure you know this, but the reason it took so long to get this to the big leagues is that within baseball, they were playing around with the definition of the strike zone to see what the impact would have. The hope was you could produce more balls in play, lower the strikeout rate by doing this. And so they messed around with a thinner plate, taller plate, shorter plate, a lot of different dimensions to the strike zone over these last 5 years since when they began testing it in the Atlantic League. And the reason that they settled on this zone had nothing to do with that, because they couldn't find any definition of the strike zone that created more action, which was the hope. What they wound up doing is the ABS zone is just the zone that feels the most like a strike when you're watching it, okay? But it's a very different zone than we've ever had in baseball. And so Andrew Bailey, who's the pitching coach of the Red Sox, said to me this spring, we're working with 3 strike zones now, basically. We've got that ABS zone, we've got the human zone, and then we've got the rule book. The rule book zone is different than either of them, okay? And so you literally have hitters, pitchers, catchers trying frantically to relearn the most important question in baseball, which is, what's a strike? And it's creating a lot of stuff. The strike zone used to be, before ABS, 3D. Now it's 2D. They tried placing the invisible pane of glass at the front of the plate. And what was that causing? I was at some of these games in the Atlantic League. It was hilarious. Balls were being caught by the catcher with their mitt resting on the dirt. And the robot was calling strike because it had just clipped that triangle at the very bottom of the zone at the front of the plate. But literally, nobody else in the park thought it was a strike except a robot. So now they place the invisible pane of glass halfway back. What does it mean? It means those pitches are not strikes anymore. But some pitches that used to be strikes for as long as we've watched baseball aren't anymore. Like that two-seamer, that sinker that would come in at the knees and then dip. That used to be a strike. Now it's not because it's below the zone.
I celebrate that as a hitter. That would have killed me anyway. So I'm happy about that.
Actually. So there's adjustments that and everybody is tinkering now, trying to figure out how can they exploit this. That like spin at the top of the zone that looks so high when it gets to the front of the plate, but ticks that pane of glass at the top. That's now a strike. backdoor spin, backdoor sweepers that when they get to the front of the plate, they're 4 inches outside, no hitter's going to swing at that. Oh, whoops! It veers in and it hits that pane of glass. It hits the ABS strike zone in the middle, at the middle of the plate where the pane of glass is. That's now a strike. Everybody is trying to get a handle on this, and until they do, I'm assuming it's going to take some time. We're not going to see Major League Baseball make any changes, but at some point, I think there will be some tweaks. Trying to get me to predict what they are, too soon to tell.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so many complicating factors. Like hitters generally swing less early in the season. And so early season walk rates are a little bit higher, as a league than the rest of the season. But in the history of baseball, we've only had 4 seasons with a walk rate over 9.6. And this year it's at 10%. So if this holds, it might be one of the biggest walk seasons of all time. We also saw strikeout rates are up, and that's something they don't want. But this also mirrors what happened in the minor leagues, right? When it went to ABS, we saw walks and strikeouts go up. And it's just weird to try to get your mind around how are walks and strikeouts going up? How are there fewer called strikes but more walks, and and how could this also be run suppressive somehow? So it's like, at some level, I think you're right. Just preach patience on some level. It's like we just have to let some of this figure itself out and see how it's going to happen. But I'm trying to predict the future. I just see my ground truth is the catchers are good at this. They're doing best. I'm going to invest in catchers. I'm going to tell my catchers they can challenge more, be more aggressive, get more strikes. And the numbers so far bear that out.
Yeah, that's really interesting use of the traject machine, I think, that Jayson brought up. I think I read about that for the Nationals in particular, because you can't have everybody in camp, all your pitchers, throwing more than you want them to throw just to get more reps, but you get them behind the machine and quiz them as they're going. Throw the stuff that your guys are going to actually throw. You can replicate that spin, that velocity, and work on it. Like, I think there's been a nice advantage for teams that put in that extra work, and I think as teams realize where they're deficient, they're going to quickly adjust. I think the biggest thing that I'm curious about is the pitchers that are taking advantage of the situation or just have stuff that naturally plays better in this automated zone. How long will that be effective before the approach that hitters use against them changes and they can take away something? I think situations like that are going to help explain some of the gaps we might see in Eno's pitch model, right? If you see a guy with a low stuff plus number getting great results, part of it might just be having a pitch or a combination of pitches or command that works really well with the zone as it is now. And whether that's a month or a half season or a whole season where that remains an advantage, I have no idea.
Yeah, Eno was on this from the beginning, and stuff plus, I think, is a metric to watch this season, because I talked to a lot of pitchers about this in spring training, and I think there's universal agreement. The pitchers this benefits most are the guys who can just pour unhittable pitches into the strike zone and have no fear of the bat, because the zone is different. Trying to play around and nick corners or get guys to chase with a tighter zone that the hitters are starting to figure out, I don't know that that's going to work long term. So, Tarek Skugel, baby, I'm all in on guys like that.
I'm always all in on those guys. They're deadly in any zone. You could put a postage stamp in there. But I do wonder, like, guys are like north-south, or more east-west in terms of movement. Will that play a role? The guys which, like you mentioned, if it's a little bit wider or that upper corner, some guys just have the stuff that lends itself to be effective, work the top of the zone. It reminds me of, I think it was 2000 when Sandy Alderson was heading up this initiative, pre-technology in this way, to raise the strike zone. They were like, we're calling the high strike. It's bad. We got to follow the rule book. So they went all through spring training and told us this is the new zone. We're training the umpires. They're ready. And with the human factor, it lasted like 2 months. I mean, they gave up. But they were trying to get to the letter of the law, and and they couldn't program it. They didn't have ABS, but they found some way to try to capture something that was not only, it was a letter and create the spirit of it in the game. And it was really, it didn't work. It just didn't work. And now you have technology that's going to be rigid within that. And I think the game, everybody's going to have to swirl and adapt around it. And that's where all the curiosity kind of lies.
Yeah, they do not want fewer balls in play. So if this is going to produce fewer balls in play in any significant way, you'll see some tweaks to what's a strike.
Yeah. And I wouldn't be surprised if they actually lower the top, because that's where the most new called strikes are, is the top corners. And so if they think that that's leading to walks and that's leading to strikeouts, they can just lower that. I mean, that's the good, like the quote unquote good news about, ABS and going to this is that we can be more precise. And so like Doug is talking about a time when they're like, let's do the high strike. And they're like, okay, but where is the high strike? And, but now with the computers, you can be like, this is where the high strike is, and this is this. So you can be more precise. So you can say, let's take an inch off the top or whatever. And I guess you can be more precise. What makes me nervous is that we're going to be strike zone reporting every year, and they're going to, I don't know, would they be required to tell us even? They could just, shave an inch off the top and tell the umpires and not tell us. And, it's like we did the ball reporting for 5 or 6 years where we were like, oh, the ball's different again this year. So, oh, the strike zone's different again this year.
You could literally take your strike zone with you. That's what's like cool as a hitter. It's like, that's my zone. Like it's identifiable. It's not like malleable, and it's like, that is my zone. I feel like I could study with that. I would be better than when like, okay, this umpire's calling today, or I don't even factor them in. I'm just, I'm curious about that, because I've always been challenged with the fact that I was always aggressive, and I wonder, like, are people just inherently more disciplined, or is it something to do with the construct? If I'm naturally a high ball hitter, I don't want to take that pitch. I want to swing at that pitch. So my zone was always elevated, but maybe I was good at the corners. So I'm just curious, like, what it will say about what means a disciplined hitter and what isn't, and will that change at all?
Well, I think you can see two changes at the top. One is, when you talk about those pitches that are up and on the corners, the reason they were never strikes before is because the human zone was not a rectangle. The human zone was a oval. And so those pitches never got called, but the robots don't care. And you've seen human umpires adapt to the new robotized strike zone, and those pitches are getting called. So I don't know if it's possible to try to accommodate that in some way. They decided no, but stay tuned on that. The other thing is, I've never understood this. We live in a world where we can literally measure every single thing that happens on the field, right? It's what Hawkeye does. And somehow or other, the one thing they have not been able to do is come up with a way to model the top of the strike zone by a guy's stance. It's just purely percentage of height.
It's only his height. That means that every hitter has to now be more vertical.
Yeah, so if you're a croucher, your zone just got bigger, way bigger. And that doesn't seem fair. And I mean, you guys know more about this than me, but you couldn't use wearable technology to model the top of the strike zone to the guy's actual stance?
That's a CBA thing. But maybe the MLBPA would be like, sure, we allow it for this or whatever.
The league has said, no, we can't do it. I'm just not there yet.
Yeah, I'm always skeptical when they say they can't do something. It's like, you can't, or you don't want to, or it's expensive in your eyes, so you don't want to spend the money. Like, I always have a follow-up.
But would hitters game that system? They'd be like Cal Ripken Jr., like every day at a new stance. Like, okay, I'm gonna be the violin. I'm gonna be laying down on the plate.
Yeah.
It's like,
oh yeah, who was it? Tovar that used to scratch all the way down on two strikes.
Phil Plantier and stuff.
But I mean, yeah, there's other things like that. For example, we don't actually have in Hawkeye a solution where there's no plate, like there's no like imaginary plate that like the ball's going through where they're like that's the location. What they're doing is it's a 9-fit vector. It's like they take 9 pieces of information when the ball is released, and then they model the ball in space, and they say this is where this ball should arrive. And so the error comes from the model of where the ball should arrive and where it actually arrived. And when I asked, why don't you just do something where you basically have a bunch of cameras looking at the plate, and I think they were basically said that would be financially unfeasible. But I don't know, it's a pretty well-heeled league. I mean, what is financially unfeasible? Are we talking about like $1 million extra per park, or I don't know. So that's when people talk about like where's that error come from. And then lastly, we went past this really quickly, but the buffer zone idea, from what I gather from Tom Tango, who's like the chief data scientist for baseball, the problem with the buffer zone idea is that you would have to have a different buffer zone for if the catcher challenged or if the hitter challenged, right? You'd have to switch the buffer zone in or out. And if you didn't do that, and if you just added the buffer zone to both sides, then functionally you're just making the strike zone bigger. And then would there be a buffer zone to the buffer zone? You could get into some weird, infinite loop situation. But
I can tell you they gave me a different answer on this, which is that, like, as somebody who's asked way too many questions about the margin of error, the median margin of error is a sixth of an inch. I mean, we're overturning pitches that are less than a tenth of an inch. But the margin of error is a sixth of an inch. But they have 95% confidence that the pitch will be within 4/10 of an inch of where the ABS cartoon says it is, and 99% confidence that it'll be within half an inch of where the ABS animation says it is. So when you start thinking about this, you're looking up at the scoreboard, you're watching the animation, it shows you where the pitch was, and you're thinking, wow, that's amazing that they can pinpoint it that close, except they can't really, okay, because there is this margin of error.
There should be a little like shadow zone around the ball. There should be a shadow ball around it.
When I asked, aren't you telling me that there's a handful of pitches every game that are as much as a half an inch off from where the animation says they came in? And that's not technically true because it's a median. It's not an average. I know nobody out there is a math professor, but what that means is that on any given pitch, it's possible that the animation could be 3 inches off, 6 inches off, 3 feet off. I mean, that'll never happen, okay? But theoretically, that can happen. So whatever you decide the margin of error is, it could be wrong on any given pitch, including that pitch you challenged. Okay, so they're saying that technologically it doesn't work. The other thing to know is that, like, this was a thing that went around. It was kicked around by the competition committee. The players on the competition committee weren't even sure what they thought. They polled players around the league. They weren't in favor, so it never got proposed. But Casey Mize, who's on that competition committee, pitcher for the Tigers, this is the way he described the problem with it. You're going to put the animation on the scoreboard, and people are going to see in the animation on the board that pitch was in the strike zone, but we're going to say it's a ball. You're causing some problems if you do that. You get it? So it all makes sense to have this, they don't like buffer zone. I would say a zone where the call stands, just like replay, because it's too close to call. But it creates issues to go down that road, and they don't want those issues.
Yeah, inconclusive on a ball strike call would be unsatisfying, even if it's true, right? So
we're not sure.
We want resolutions. We want absolutes. We don't want the gray area. We want black and white calls. Well, we need to go. This has been a fantastic episode with you guys. Looking forward to the full return of Starkville coming up 1 week from Saturday, April 18th. It is big time. We have a new mayor coming in. We don't know who that mayor actually is yet. Wow. So that announcement will probably be a few episodes into the return of Starkville, but people are frantically getting to the polls to get their votes in for new mayor of Starkville. But Jayson, Doug, thank you both for joining us today. If anybody out there wants to join the Discord, you can do that with the link in the show description. If you happen to be a mathematics professor, hit us up. Let us know. Like the situation Jayson was describing was making my head spin. So let's try to put some more imagery around this a little bit and figure out the solution. I think we're headed in the right direction, though. That's going to do it for this episode of Rates and Barrels. We're back with you on Wednesday.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to hit that subscribe or follow button so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed it, drop us a like, leave a rating, or sound off in the comments. We'll see you next time.